Hey everybody, my name is Alex with Hake Hardware, and we are finally doing it, the ultimate autonomous guide. This is going to be part one. It's really just an introduction, so if you're pretty familiar with Autonomous and you just want to get right into it, you might just want to skim this, but this is going to be the first part where I just talk about some things that we need to know before we get going into the rest of the parts. So let's start out with requirements. And this may be a poorly named section, but this is just letting you know what I'm using for this guide because you might not want to use the same things I am, or you might not be using the same things I am. So the first thing is I'm going to be using Docker. Everything that I do is typically in Docker containers. I'm a big fan of Docker. Some people think it's pointless to run, just a single application in Docker. I disagree with that, but ultimately it's really your own choice. So in this guide, there's going to be quite a few Docker containers we end up deploying, especially if you do the space acres monitoring. That's also Docker based. So you're going to have all of your cluster containers as or all of your cluster components as Docker containers. You're going to have your node as a Docker container. Nats runs in Docker. Everything runs in Docker. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I'm going to be running Ubuntu Server and Ubuntu Desktop. So the computer I'm recording this from is an Ubuntu desktop, and I'll get into my setup. Actually, that's going to be the next section, just so that you understand what I'm working with, because that informs kind of what I'm going to be deploying as far as my configuration goes. And you're going to need to probably adopt it a little bit for your setup. And understanding what I'm doing and why I'm doing it might make it easier for you to understand what would work best for your setup. And then I'm going to be using clusters, and that it's some people again think that if you only have one PC, like let's say you just have, I'm on an Ubuntu desktop computer, let's say all my SSDs are on this computer. Clusters are sort of meant for if you want to do more distributed farms where you have multiple computers, multiple plotters plotting your disks, multiple farmers farming disks. They can all work together and share resources. I just like how clusters are set up. Um, Initially, I'm only going to have one computer that's holding all of my SSDs. I plan to potentially use like the GPU in my Ubuntu desktop to help plot when the GPU plotter is out. I don't have any disks on this computer, but I want to be able to temporarily, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but I want to be able to temporarily add a plotter to one of my PCs to help plot and then be able to remove that. Um, so it's just a good way to share resources, and there's no drawbacks really other than, in fact, there's only benefits because even like typically when you add like a 4 terabyte SSD, there's a small portion of that that's reserved for the cache for plotting. So when you run a cluster, that cache is moved to an actual separate Docker container that can be on like a smaller SSD. You need like 100 gigabytes or so for your cache. You can move that off your main SSD, so you get a little bit extra space. So there's a lot of benefits to running clusters, and there's really no drawbacks other than you just have more containers. Okay, so I also have a link to the official docs in here. If you're totally new to Autonomous, like there's a lot of docs, and as a result, it just means there's a lot of information, and I can't put it all in this, even though this is the ultimate autonomous guide. I can't cover everything, or else this would be, 20 YouTube videos long, and I'd be doing this for a full month. I mean, they have a whole team like working on docs and stuff, so this is you just need a little bit of a primer. You need to understand kind of like what components are involved, and we'll go over them, but it's just good to look at the docs a little bit. So let's go over my setup. That way you can understand sort of what I'm building here. So Bender, Johnny 5, and Terminator, they're all robots if you haven't picked up the theme. Uh, these are my three computers that I have right now. I used to have way more than this, but I moved and my office is much smaller. I'm still actually getting my office set up, but I needed to make some sacrifices, so I sold off and just decommissioned a lot of my servers, and I just built this one Threadripper computer that is going to have 100 terabytes worth of SSDs. It's an always-on computer. I have multiple projects on here. And some of them are just like personal fun projects, some of them are crypto projects, and then I have an RTX 4090 here. So just to kind of understand as far as it relates to Autonomys, the Threadripper's, it's okay for plotting. It's really the RTX 4090 that's going to be the main plotting resource here, but we don't have the GPU plotter yet. So this is just kind of waiting, and I also run some like AI stuff on here, so having the 4090 is helpful for that. My personal computer that I'm actually recording this video on is Bender. It's running Ubuntu desktop because I do like a GUI. I'm fully on Ubuntu now because I can't stand Microsoft. If you haven't tried Ubuntu desktop as just like your main desktop, like I use a lot of specialized programs. Like I have OBS for recording this video, DaVinci for doing some video editing stuff, Discord, Termius, SQL clients. What else do I have on here? Like 1Password for my password manager, Signal for messaging, like all that you can install and it works great on Ubuntu. So the only thing is gaming. There's a website that shows you like which games work and don't work on Ubuntu, but for me, I prioritized getting off Windows and going full Ubuntu. And yes, there's some frustrating things about Ubuntu, but in my mind, there's more frustrating things about Windows. So anyways, I have Termius on here. So the reason why I bring this up, this is an SSH manager. I bring this up because I want everybody to know like it's really easy to do autonomous stuff when you can SSH in from like a GUI. So like if you install Ubuntu server on Terminator and you just log into Ubuntu server and you have a terminal, like it's really hard to copy paste things. You can't even like open up, this guide and copy paste commands. It's easier to SSH in from a GUI, whether that's Windows or Ubuntu desktop. It's best to have like a GUI that you can open up this website and you can copy paste codes, or you can watch the YouTube video while you're going over it and be able to copy and paste codes into Termius. So I use Bender to SSH into Johnny 5 and Terminator because it allows me to copy paste things. And I turn this one off periodically. And again, I mention that mainly just so you understand, like, I'm not installing any autonomous stuff on here because I turn it off. Like I could run my node on here, I could run NATs or, a cache on here, but I'm going to be turning this off every night, when I'm done for the day. So there's no real point in running like projects that need to always be on. Johnny 5 is a mini PC that I use. It's always on. I use it to host things like Portainer, where it's just um, I literally never turn this off. Like Terminator might get restarted every once in a while. And Johnny 5 does get restarted for like updates and stuff and just to keep it um, working well, but it's rare that this thing ever gets turned off. So I run a lot of my always on stuff that doesn't require a lot of power. So this just has like a 4-core Celeron CPU. I do have multiple projects hosted on here where I'm just like hosting something minimal that doesn't require a lot of resources. So this is just, it runs, Portainer and a few other always on things. Okay, then we talked about Terminator. That's going to be like the main subspace resource here. I'm going to be running everything on it that is like a cluster related. And actually, let's just go down to this is exactly what my autonomous setup is. And a future is just like I can add this with a farmer plotter in the future. So we'll kind of touch on that. But Terminator is going to run my cluster. A cluster is made up of 4 components. We have a farmer. The farmer Um, just look at this diagram down here. The farmer actually has the SSDs connected to it. So when we launch this Docker container, we're going to be specifying the SSDs, the cache. Again, this can be separate from your actual farming SSDs. I just have like a 2 terabyte NVMe for my operating system that I use for Termius, and I'm just going to use 100 gigabytes of that for my cache disk, so it's separate from my farms. And if you think about it, like if I don't know the exact equation, so don't take this for like actual fact, but when you're not running a cluster, every SSD, let's say you have 10 SSDs, every one of those has to have a cache. Whereas instead, when you're running like a cluster and you have a dedicated cache, you just have one that they're all sharing. So it's kind of a nice savings for space. And then we have the plotter, and that's basically going to be using your CPU or when the GPU plotter is out to plot sectors, replot sectors. So all of these can sort of be installed independently. I mean, you need a controller and you need a cache in order to have a farmer and a plotter. And you need to install NATS, which is like just a communications framework for the cluster. It's completely separate from Autonomys. There's lots of projects that use NATS. It's just a way to like have things communicate with each other. So you'll see when we deploy these containers, you're going to put the IP address for NATS in all of these so they know like how to contact it. And then separate from the cluster is the node. The node is not, there's like the farmer side and then the node side. And the node handles the blockchain state and it connects to the controller. So looking at my setup here, Johnny 5, which if you remember, that's just the mini PC, is going to be running my node. And I run it separate from Terminator because I have really crappy SSDs. They're the team group ones. They're 4 terabytes. A lot of times they just go offline. I'm still trying to figure out a way to do it without restarting the computer, but basically once they go offline, I have to restart Terminator. And in the future, I do think I might add another computer. I've got this really big thermal take. If you've seen like the W200, it's basically like a dual computer case. Right now I just have one computer in there, so I might add like another Threadripper or something in a couple months and have like a dual system. Right now I'm limited by power. If I were to add two systems plus all my other stuff that's running, I think I'd blow the circuit breaker. So, but the point is, the node I'm keeping on Johnny 5 because when Terminator restarts, if I have another farmer, they're going to lose the node. And the node needs to be online and accessible for all of the uh, PCs that are going to be farming or plotting. Now, if this was just a plotter, it wouldn't really make a difference because if it's plotting to Terminator and Terminator restarts, like it doesn't need to really have the node connected. Yeah. So again, like you could put the node on the same on Terminator, and that's totally fine. And you could even do it with other PCs and have the node on one of your farmers. But just remember, when you turn off or restart this, all of your other farmers are going to throw a bunch of errors and probably crash because the node is gone. Okay, I need a little bit more coffee. Ah, that is good. All right. Ba, 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 ba. So yeah, I recommend reading through this article. I'm kind of just winging it as far as the video goes because we're not really running any commands. We're not actually starting anything yet. But let's just go over each of the different things again real quick. So um, these are really all the components. So the controller, that's going to be a Docker container. Farmer is a Docker container. Cache is a Docker container. Plotter is a Docker container. NATS, node, those are all Docker containers. And we're going to create a stack file in Portainer. And you really just like deploy these stack files. It's so easy. You're going to see that running, if you were to not run clusters, you would just have a node and a farmer. So just two Docker containers. And yes, That is more simple, but when you think of it, uh, they're still stack files where you just deploy them. So in the end, it's basically the same. Okay, and we're kind of getting to the end of the guide here, but let's just go over what the next few parts are going to be about. So we're in part one. It's just an introduction, just to kind of let you know what my current setup is and what we're going to be doing in this video. Next, we're going to set up Docker and Portainer, and I have a lot of guides on setting up Docker and Portainer, but this one's going to be like purely focused on getting it set up and ready for Autonomous. And then part three, we're going to be launching our node. Part four, we'll be preparing all the drives. So we're going to have to format them. We're going to have to set up the permissions correctly. We're going to have to mount them and get them to added to the FS file system tab, FS tab, uh, so that they mount automatically when you reboot. Then we will deploy the cluster, and then we'll go over like some monitoring. So there's Grafana, which is kind of like a all-in-one monitoring application. There's some metrics that get posted to Prometheus with Autonomous, and you can pull in those metrics. Then there's Spaceport. That's a custom monitoring application that I've built. We'll go over both of those because monitoring is going to be important, especially if you have a lot of disks. Part 8, I'm just going to cover some important things, like if you need to build your own Docker images. So you can skip to that, like let's say the Docker images aren't working for you. You can build your own for your own system, and they should work. Like there's no legacy uh, Docker images. Like if you're running something before, I think like Cascade Lake or something like that, you're going to need to build your own Docker containers. And then how to update your containers when there's new updates, how to add new drives, and just anything else I can think of that would be helpful. Part 9, we're going to go over advanced clusters. So there's more benefits to clusters than what I've talked about. One of those is that if you're running lots of PCs, you can have redundancy in your cluster by adding additional NATS clusters. You can run multiple caches, multiple controllers, and that'll basically make your cluster more resilient. And there's really not a lot of extra overhead. Like, yes, if you run another cache, you need to use another 100 gigabytes for that cache. But if you have a bunch of PCs and you have just an extra 100 gigabytes on whatever SSDs you used for the operating system, then easy. You can add this redundancy. Um, and then the last part, part 10, we're going to talk about running an operator. So they're still planning to do Stake Wars. If you're not familiar with Stake Wars, you can check out in, I think it's in the docs. They go over the Stake Wars. But basically, you can run an operator, which is a specialized node, and you can potentially earn uh, from running that operator. So we'll go over how to run an operator. You need a little bit better requirements for your like PC. Yeah, I think you need to just have a little bit more RAM, a little bit more CPU power, and it's not really recommended to run an operator on the same computer as you are farming because you'll see like when you're plotting, like your disk CPU usage is like 100%, and that might change with like GPU plotting, but again, it's like ideal to run the operator on sort of a dedicated computer. And then there's going to be part 11, which is not in here, but when the GPU plotter comes out, I'll have like an updated part 11, basically for anybody that's used this guide. I'll have another video on how to convert to using a GPU plotter from your CPU. So it's not in here yet, but if the GPU plotter does come out, or well, it's definitely coming out, and when it does, I'll have a video on that. And then I'll end this with just some good things to know. If you're new to Autonomous, like this might be information that you would want to ask. So I'll just give you the answer now. Most of my users or video watchers will already know this because they've been using Autonomous, but the disk space can be increased or decreased. So let's say initially you have a 4 terabyte hard drive and you do 3 terabytes. You can increase that to all 4 terabytes if you want, without replotting the whole drive. So it just fills up the remaining part of the drive. Although, like, decreasing and increasing, I've never had an issue with increasing. Sometimes decreasing gets a little weird, so try to size the disks as best you can. I'll put in, when we get to the disk section, I'll put in how to basically calculate exactly, you want to leave like a tiny bit of space on your disks. So we'll go over kind of like how to calculate the size of the disk that you should be using. And then you need to keep your node and the cluster or farmer operating to receive rewards. So certain other blockchains, like Space Mesh, you can kind of turn off your system. You still need to keep a node on for it to all work, but you can turn off like a lot of your farm when it's not like a cycle gap. You can't use hard drives. So the way how this works is there's a lot of like random access to your drives, and I'm not like a technical person when it comes to this stuff, so I could be off on exactly the reason why, but you can't use hard drives because they're just not going to be fast enough. And it's not about like transfer speed, it's about access speed. So you're gonna miss your opportunity to submit rewards because it's gonna take too long for your hard drive to find what it needs to find. The node actually syncs pretty quick. They have like a snap sync, I think it's called, but it's basically a quick sync where it actually takes less than an hour for me to sync typically, so don't worry too much about syncing your node. It happens really quick. You do need to open your ports for the node, and we will cover that in the node section. I'll show you how I do it on my computer, but it's going to be different for everybody because it's based on your router or your modem. And typically you can just Google your modem or router model and find out how to port forward it. When you first launch your farm, you're going to generate a piece cache. And it's a little confusing. Like back in the day, you used to not be able to plot until your piece cache was created, but now your piece cache will uh, be created while you're plotting. So it's kind of nice. Uh, and it typically only happens once. So it's not too big of a deal. More space, this is probably obvious for most people, but more storage means more rewards. So if you're running 100 terabytes worth of SSDs, you're going to get more rewards than someone running 10 terabytes. You're probably going to get like 10 times the rewards because you have 10x more storage. And then I touched on this already, but it's way easier to set everything up from a PC with a graphical user interface like Ubuntu Desktop or Windows or Mac OS, and then SSH into your Ubuntu servers, like I'm doing, where I'm SSHing from Bender into Terminator and Johnny 5. So it's just, I think most people are going to be running a setup like this, but just keep that in mind. And then here's some resources. I'll have a link to this article, but the Autonomous website, docs, some farming docs, some information on clusters. Like if we open this up, they go into a little bit more in depth into what each thing is. Again, like I can't cover all of this. I'm mainly just going to cover getting everything set up from start to finish, because like in my opinion, the guides for that, like the install guides for the advanced CLI with Docker, like there's not a whole lot of information here. It's just a small amount, and it gets kind of confusing sometimes. So um, I definitely recommend checking out at least these first four. You don't really need to go to the Nats website and learn about that unless want to do it for another reason. But anyways, that is the end of part one. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, subscribe to my Substack. I don't expect, you don't have to be a paying member or anything to these, but I do like get motivated seeing people subscribe to my stuff. So please do if you want, and I will have part two out here. I'm going to be working on it right after I get this video uploaded, and hopefully I'll get even that video done today. So, that being said, Hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in part 2.